Karl Barks and Walt Kelly than anyone else. We certainly were able to borrow hard copies to scan from after we focused on them. Working with Frank Young, a guy who has a blog site devoted to John Stanley. Working with various scholars and whatever, and fellow cartoonists on a private back and forth conversation. And I was gnawing at what to do about Little Lulu. And I realized I was taking a conservative view of childhood, this notion of that protected time in the nursery, and that's what I wanted. Our thesis was some of the great children's literature of the 20th century was made in comics, and we would follow more or less the same guidelines that should be considered in making great children's literature. So slowing down for Archie, I finally decided that the kids who were interested in Archie were the ones who were about to sprout their first pubic hair, so they were a borderline case. They were you were just getting past latency and getting interested in the notion that there might be an other sex. And as a result, I moved myself toward Little Archie. And in one of the few cases where I let my superego rather than my heart guide me, we started looking carefully at Little Archie, and again, I just didn't love it as much as some people do. But we figured Little Archie was in that world that belonged directly next to Dennis the Menace, which is what inspired the creation of the Little Archie world. Little Archie was indeed made by an auteur, Bob Bowling, who was allowed to sign his work, and his great story, according to the experts who cared about Little Archie that we talked to, was one story that was very sincerely made and was actually very interesting formally, but man, it had the soul and heart of a Hallmark card, and I just couldn't inflict it on another generation. A story called The Long Walk Home, which if you Google it, maybe you'll be able to download a story the same way I found it. But as a result, we found one that I liked better, and it turned out that it's not by Bob Bowling, it's by his assistant who then went on to do other stories, a man named Dexter Taylor, I think, Tyler? Yeah, so I got the name wrong in the book, and we'll have to correct that in our happily announced next printing.
But we discussed the Harvey.
We discussed the Harvey books as well, and I found that the stories that really moved me in Harvey comics were the sad sack comics. That carried that blue-collar world of Popeye into the present. And it didn't seem like the most urgent thing to have, whereas Little Richie Rich and Little Lotta and Little Dot I found to be overwhelming as product rather than as art made by somebody. And again, it may be a blind spot. Somebody will come back to me and talk about the art of Warren Sattler, is that his name? One of the, I'm getting the name wrong, the specific artists who one can find. It didn't hit me or any of the other people whose eyeballs and taste I admired enough to make space for it.
But all we wanted is to actually put a marker in the bookstore, in the library, so that there would be kids' comics that would be accepted, recognized as worth attending to, so there would be more books. So somebody can come out and do
in fact, somebody's reprinting
Treasury
the Harvey series of books now through Dark Horse, I guess. And I got to read those and wasn't moved to devote this really preciously small-sized box of 350 pages, a generous collection, but it can only hit a fraction of what's available. But I wanted to make room for some of the really strange things like Intellectual Amos that nobody much has heard of, that Francoise showed one panel of the boy exploring a world of ants. Beautiful comics.
So anyway, if we did our job right, hopefully there'll be many more other books of comics by many other publishers as well. So.
We have time for one more question.
You choose them.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead. Shoot.
Just regarding the McSweeney's broadsheet issue, which I'm excited for, and sort of the question of what print could be if it tried. I mean, obviously that's a big question. Is McSweeney's playing an important role in exploring that, and could they be playing a more important role? I'm just curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, I think, Dave Eggers is an interesting man who has a very interesting website run by people who like it, but I think he's print-oriented, and as a result, I think he reads his New York Times in a hard copy, as does Francoise. I read mine on the web while grazing for The Guardian and the Washington Post daily. And he does his email in some internet cafe once a day. It's not like integrated into his life. And this special issue of McSweeney's is a plea for the pleasures of print. What he's doing among the many sections in the paper, he's doing something that will pretend to be a specific day's newspaper that he spent several months on. And included as one of the sections will be a section on how to use the model that this paper provides to actually make a newspaper that would be viable on a daily basis in regions that don't have sufficient newspapers, giving the pie chart of how much it costs, how relatively little advertising you would have to find, and what might make a newspaper that wouldn't try to compete with the up to the millisecond news that the internet can offer, but the in-depth reporting and the visual splendors and pleasures of paper while it's still being made. The irony, of course, is that he's now postponed the deadline twice. So for a daily paper, it's on shaky ground, but I'm sure it's going to be a very beautiful issue of McSweeney's.
But in terms of, responding to the more general point about print, we have, in wanting to do something for the future for our grandchildren, we have no doubt that our grandchildren will have many electronic ways to look at their images on so many different supports, but what's important to us is that there also will be books, and that those books will continue to be maybe not the central, but at least one of the things that they will grow up with.
Like one of the things on reading on the internet is there's a kind of Pavlovian reward for clicking. There's going to be something new, there's going to be something new, there's going to be something else I could look at. And as a result, it's really easy to slide from some long, abstruse article in a subject you're interested over to either Huffington Post or YouPorn, depending on your inclinations, but ultimately not to do the one thing that books really offer, and that presumably an electronic equivalent will come to eventually, which is to take that thing that hung in every library when I was growing up that said, reading is fundamental. What's even more important than reading, because you can read on the web, but what you don't do on the web very often is reread, because it's rereading that's fundamental, and pieces of paper have literal substance. They're made of something, and they encourage you to concentrate on it, to revisit it, and thereby to learn to do this thing that's called thinking. And that's part of the urgency that led Francoise to move toward using comics and the skills we both accumulated in making comics to make comics that would encourage little children to read.
Because ironically enough, kids, when they collected comics, when they were ubiquitous, they were disposable, but then every kid kept them and exchanged them and traded them and reread them. My comics when I was a kid were French comics, but still, I didn't read them just once. I read them 200 times, and I think that's one of the ways that you, again, become cogent of the making of a work. And Bob's off on you, so.
Thanks.
Thank you all for coming tonight. Thank you to Art and Françoise, a wonderful team. They're going to stick around and answer any other questions you might have and sign books. If you can form a line in the back through these photography stacks on my left, your right, I would appreciate it. Thank you.